Welcome to today's National Soil Survey Center webinar. My name is Sean McVeigh, National Training Coordinator for the Soil Science Division and host for today's webinar, SDJR is over. Now what? The webinar is being recorded and all participants joined the webinar in listen-only mode. You received the webinar audio through your device's speakers. There is no telephone dial-in. If you are having audio difficulties, please check the various ways your computer speakers may be muted or have their volume set low, including the speaker adjustments available in the Adobe Connect interface. You can maximize your webinar experience in Adobe Connect by shutting down VPN and any other programs that might compete for bandwidth. This includes email in Microsoft Outlook and instant messaging in Skype. Taking a look at our webinar room layout, Adobe Connect has content pods that include the feature presentation, chat, and Q&A pods. Use the 4-arrow icon in the featured presentation pod to enter and exit the full screen view as you choose. To submit a comment or question for me or our presenters, use the Q&A pod and type in your question. I'll handle technical difficulties the best I can while hosting the webinar and interact with our presenters to answer your questions during verbal Q&A periods. I want to thank Joe Brennan for being here to support our webinar and introduce our panel of presenters for this webinar series. Joe, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you so you can introduce the topic and our presenters.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, audio is good.
All right, excellent. So, yeah, my name's Joe Brennan. I'm a soil data quality specialist in St. Paul. I'm here in beautiful, sunny Devil's Lake, North Dakota. And I'm joined here today with Alan Galsvig, the MLRA leader here in Devil's Lake, and Lance Dewey, a resource soil scientist who's with the area staff here and was formerly an MLRA soil scientist on the staff here and was the principal investigator at the beginning of this project. So this is the third time this presentation has been given. It's been more or less the same presentation with some different titles. This is our first time presenting this as a group, so our new title is SDJR is over, now what? Rethinking the MLRA Field Project. And that's to show that this project began with a challenge to figure out what matters in your MLRA. And from the initial ideas of the project through the conclusion, we think we have one logical approach to conducting a soil survey update. Not a template, but maybe a draft, and this draft is what we're going to outline here today. In this presentation, we want to illustrate how digital mapping is only a piece of the puzzle, but it's a very important one. It's the piece that links our knowledge from investigations and analysis on out to the landscape. So we now have a new version of Part 610 of the handbook, and it provides a general framework for us in updating soil surveys, but it leaves a lot of room for exploring new ways of updating our data. We also have the new proposal for Part 648 of the handbook, and that addresses raster products. We're hopeful this new chapter will open the gate to a new era of soil survey products, products that represent our understanding of soil variability independent of scale limitations while continuing to maintain our Sergo product for as long as it's being used. This project, MLRA 55A Barnes investigation of the soil or Source lobe, was initiated in fiscal year 2015 under the lead of the MLRA staff here in Devil's Lake. It wasn't without our challenges. We did have personnel changes that led to some lost staff resources, and it's possible in the wrong environment that the project would have been tabled outright. But in the end, we spent approximately 55 to 60 staff weeks, and that includes about 12 to 15 for each of the three of us here to complete this 1.1 million acre project that spanned 2 years. So I'm going to now pass it on over to Alan Galsvig to give some local context to the landscapes and soils.
Good afternoon. I'll start with a brief overview to the general physiography of this project area. MLRA 55A is in the north-central part of North Dakota, bordering Manitoba and Saskatchewan. We like to say we're not in the Arctic, but we can feel it from here. 75% of the MLRA is soils of fine, loamy Wisconsin and till. This till is concentrated in the areas labeled glaciated plains on this slide. Separating areas of till are other areas of proglacial lake sediments. Some of these till areas adjacent to the lake sediments show evidence of being waterworked. There are delta deposits and there are aeolian deposits, some of which are coarse loamy and some sandy. You see in the top of the slide, the Turtle Mountain Moraine is a prominent feature of this area. It rises about 800 to 900 feet above the nearby ground moraine, and it separates two lobes of ground moraine. Okay, next slide. As you can see, this is in the heart of the prairie pothole region, which is kind of a duck hunter's paradise. It is also an area where subtle differences in the landform features and soil hydrology can be major factors in soil formation. Next. Recorrelations have been approached aggressively in this part of the country through SDJR and legend evaluations. Prior to the SDJR initiative, we completed the MLRA update, which reviewed the legends and map unit concepts used in initial soil surveys, and merged many corresponding landforms and map units into MLRA map units. These spanned political boundaries and were the first step to data harmonization. Map units in areas that could not be readily harmonized without further investigation were also identified. We produced a complete MLRA correlation document to capture the evaluation and assessment phase. Part of that final report of the MLRA update were issue papers which documented the remaining challenges to MLRA correlation and identifying data voids. The MLRA update was good preparation for SDJR, which took a closer look at component data and available lab data, as well as documented in NASA's remaining correlation issues and important future investigations for each map unit. Through MLRA correlation and the SDJR process, total map units in the MLRA were reduced to just over 300 MLRA map units, starting from almost 1,200 county subset map units. NASA's data is generally to the current common standard, and property and interpretive products exhibited much improved consistency. So where to go next? Having created a long list of field investigations that could be done, what should we do first? We looked at what major depth discrepancies remained and what projects would matter most in the future. The regional office wanted us to focus on significant projects, what might call getting some bang for your buck type projects. So benchmark soils seemed like a logical starting point where the findings of a project could be extrapolated. Our team chose a project in the Barnes series, which is a benchmark soil, as a logical beginning to a new phase of MLRA updates. Why Barnes? First, it is the dominant soil from the most extensive catena in the MLRA. Second, there's correlation issues and issues of soil change which were apparent in the current soil survey product. And thirdly, findings of the evaluation suggest that geomorphic relationships to soil properties needed further study. The Barnes series is considered a well-drained soil with slopes that range from 0 to 25%. The central concept of the Barnes has no saturation apparent in the series control section. Barnes is extensively mapped, though, in low-relief areas with less than 6% slopes. And about 800,000 acres of Barnes is mapped in complex with much wetter soils. The majority of these acres are within our project area. In NASA's, we have identified water tables as shallow as 120 centimeters in spring, which is outside the series concept. That's before we started this project. And water table studies, however, are very limited in these soils. The variability in county-level map unit design persists in many places after SDJR, even where map units are tagged as MLRA map units. Issues from the long-range plan don't often fit neatly into one or two map units or in relation to county issues. A broader evaluation may be necessary to properly frame the full scope of future projects, reviewing a suite of similar soils and map units across the MLRA. In this future project, the issues were documented from the evaluation of 9 MLRA map units shown on the screen, representing a catena. Each map unit had 2 or 3 major components. In the lower part of the slide is a list of more specific concerns from SDJR and what we wanted to address in future projects. To work towards seamless MLRA map units, stratifying by physiographic areas seemed to be a logical starting point. We thought it would be best to investigate the unique geomorphic patterns of 3 specific lobes in the glacial advances. All 3 are predominantly fine loamy till. Red River lobe is in the eastern part of it, 55A. Leeds lobe is in the central part, and Souris lobe in the western part. Most of the low relief ground moraine in the Souris lobe lies west and southwest of the Turtle Mountains. Unique origins of materials led to a working hypothesis that the properties, hydrology, and spatial patterns have significant differences to be captured. Depicted in the Souris lobe is the extent of the 9 map units and Statsko delineations outlining the general boundary of the Barnes-Katina in this lobe. Why begin with the Souris lobe? The area has variable county soil survey products with variety in age and map unit design. The initial soil survey work was started in the late 1950s in Ward County, while in adjoining counties the initial surveys some were not completed till 25 plus years later. The map unit concepts, map unit design, as well as some series concepts have been revised or new ones established during that intervening time period. Also, the scale and mapping intensity were different between the several counties. Discrepancies are reflected in soil property and interpretive products. These discrepancies could not be sufficiently addressed through SDJR. Correlation issues are often the most apparent to the high-end users performing analysis at broader scales. County soil survey publications were originally designed to aid in general resource and conservation planning at a more detailed scale, and correlation issues are a significant impediment to the use of soil survey products in resource assessments. Fixing inconsistencies using measurable data and spatial tools seem necessary. And now Lance Dewey will discuss the resource concerns.
A little overview of the Souris lobe. 83% of this area is considered cropped. Most of the crops are small grains or oilseed dominant. Review of the cropping patterns in this project area across several years indicates variable success in annual crop production. Pay close attention to slides from 2011 and 2013. You can see that there's some issues with wetness on the ground. Existing mapping is dominated by well-drained and moderately well-drained soils. These are young landscapes with numerous small seasonal depressions with hydric soils and low slope gradients in the wetlands. So how well do we account for the depressional soils, aquic conditions, and system hydrology? There's resource concerns for these areas. First, number 1, mechanical limitations in the cropland due to density of depressional soils, which significantly limit management. 2, wetter years may yield extensive prevent plant conditions beyond potholes. And 3, variable climatic conditions have led to increased salinization in some parts of the landscape. Specific objectives for this project included investigation of remaining joint issues, sample representative benchmark soils across geomorphic surfaces to help determine if soil property and interpretive differences exist. Sites in all the lobes include instrumentation and characterization. One site is within the Souris project area, and investigations into the Leeds and Red River lobe will feed future projects in those areas. We also want to look into the possibility of doing some digital soil mapping in these areas. Field investigations. Field work began in the spring of 2015. We selected primary and backup sampling sites by dividing up project areas into 6 sampling zones. We used natural geomorphic breaks along with imagery, map units, and tacit knowledge. We then relayed the sites to the district conservationist, who in turn contacted the producers for us. For documentation, we completed brief soil descriptions and traverses of the upland landform positions, several sites across the project area. A site in a representative landscape was instrumented with 8 data loggers, an open wells, and 1 on-site rain gauge. Subsoil characterization data was collected and analyzed through KSSL with preliminary results available prior to correlation. Sampling was completed concurrently with the installation of the wells. Initial review of the findings. In preparation for the initial review, we summarized observed changes across different surfaces with unique topography and setting. We found 3 unique soil landscapes. The Cirrus Till Plain contains donut topography that has frequent depressions, broad summits, and redox features commonly observed within 75 centimeters. In a wave-washed till adjacent to Glacial Lake Cirrus, we have nearly level landscapes. This area has fewer depressions, along with a siltier texture, and carbonates are much closer to the surface in the upland positions. In the Bodno Till Plain, we have our most prominent moraine topography, again with trends of carbonates being much closer to the surfaces in the uplands and on the summit and shoulder positions. Initial review of our findings. Reviewing the first year of our well data, it's been apparent that these soils are wetter than once considered. We will have a general expected trend of wetter soils on lower positions, but in all these positions, soil saturation is found within the series control section in the first 2 months of the growing season, and this is not within the range of the barn series. Trends on the landscape positions and relationships of water tables to redox features can be useful in the review, even with just a couple of years of data. The redox stats on the left up here are based on the 150 observations that we did within the Cirrus Till Plain. We now have over 3 years of water table data. The free water is trending higher than was once identified, but it does appear to be slightly below the observed redox depth in the wettest months. Seasonal variations in water table are following our expected trends so far through year one through 3. However, there's a high amount of variation from year to year. The general trends in our data include fall recharge, followed by deep frost in a wet, cold spring, and then followed by a dry summer. It's easy to connect the results of the water table to the land use and cropping cycles that we saw a few slides back and see why there's issues with wetness and prevent plants. In these 3 examples here on the slide, on-site redox range from 36 to 76 centimeters. I'll now turn it back to Alan Goldsvig to discuss the mapping criteria.
Okay, well, after an initial review of the soil descriptions from Lance's traverses, we drafted a soil property key assuring that appropriate documentation would be collected. With necessary lab data found in field descriptions and a soil property key, we could be consistent then in our modeling and correlation. Consistent interpretation of the geomorphic descriptions was also assured on all training data that was collected later. In our evaluation of the descriptions, we looked at all the property data collected, recognizing that some observations were in a transition zone hydrologically between these classifications. The landform position and slope data that we collected were critical in making correlation decisions for those transition observations. Now I'll turn it over to Joe.
All right. So during the initial review after the first field season, it came to light that the crew was emphasizing the upland landform positions with significantly less documentation on the wetter segments of the landscape. So we looked at methods of balancing out the training data, which included targeting some specific landform positions for documentation where they were underemphasized prior. And those could be done during the field review, and they were done relatively quickly. And then we also balanced our training data with ancillary data. In this case, it was a combination of National Wetland Inventory data, some Sergocon associations, And then just plain old image interpretation just to identify these wettest components, which in this case is the Argiaquic RGL ball. But eventually we were able to finalize about 290 points of training data to represent the understanding of soils across the landscape. So the crew up here was pretty convinced that soil development in the uplands were distinct enough across the area that we should consider stratifying some further analysis by zones. And I think our initial summaries of the data that we did at the time supported this trend. So the two zones shown here were critical to a lot of our further efforts. And then in approaching modeling, we really were going to take a look at a few different response variables, both components and some of the geomorphic descriptors that were identified in the field, and also hydrology to evaluate what was effective. Some items that we might pay attention to closer in future projects could include developing a common standard for point documentation at the beginning of a project, and also removing some of our bias in our sampling design for training data. So here in the Souris till plain, we have a very low amount of local relief. We're talking in the neighborhood of 15 feet in a 40-acre area or somewhere there around. Thankfully, we have the appropriate elevation data for the entire project area from LIDAR. This sort of data really is essential for any terrain analysis in these sorts of landscapes. Terrain and hydrologic derivatives are really going to be our most significant and reliable localized predictor variables to leverage against our training data set. So in this project, we're going to focus on soil properties, soil attributes, relief, and the space dynamic of the ScorePan model. So we can kind of group our relief-centered predictor variables into three general classes. We have local relief, slope form, and then hydrology. And these hummocky landforms, looking at the same covariate at different neighborhoods, can help us discern processes at different scales from micro-relief to a hill slope and on up to the greater landscape. Wetness in closed landscapes may also be evaluated in different manners, both with I think what a lot of us are familiar with, the wetness index or compound topographic index, looking at the concept of upslope catchment. But we also, in this project, looked at upslope distance from depression. So for the applied modeling component of the project, we again looked at several response variables of soil properties and classes from our field documentation. We looked at several different classification methods, but random forests continued to show some strong potential for both like a classification type models and regression type models. The success of several classifications were employed rather than relying on a single classification. Here in this slide, we have a preliminary random forest classification on soil series and kind of a hydrogeomorphic position. Each classification was again conducted independently with training points. Note here on the series model that there is a broad upland class. And this represents a grouping of 3 extensive series in higher positions on the landform. These series were poorly discriminated in our global model for both zones, and it also had high out-of-bag air in our zone-specific models. But this upland class represents an aggregation of those 3 classes, and it really flags for future reference that we're going to do some more intensive zone-specific modeling on that class. So depth to redox has some of the strongest correlations, and I think the same could probably be said for a lot of similar glaciated landscapes, such as this one, especially closed landscapes. So we felt with some confidence that we had a model of seasonal high saturation through redox that we could rely on. the mean residual error here is kind of exaggerated from the pieces of the landscape where saturation was really close to the surface, but we had a decent model, so we went with it. In our zone-specific classifications here on the right, the emphasis is on modeling both soil development and the potential for soil erosion using some binary classifications of diagnostic features that occur within soil profiles. So our diagnostic features were targeted with logistic regression, and this has been shown in some literature elsewhere with such things as spodic horizons. But I just wanted to note here that most methods that were described here were introduced in application to us through the Statistics for Soil Survey course. So with the previous redox model, we just did kind of a simple reclassification of our depths to render some broad concepts of drainage class. We also had our logistic regressions of those diagnostic features on the right, and we classified them into different indices. We have an erosion index and a cambic index. And from there, we used some post-classification logic to arrive at an independent classification for each zone. So in the end, we were able to replace those upland concepts with our classification here, and they were done uniquely for both zones. And this is again replacing those broader upland concepts. So now with 3 distinct and logical classifications available, we're able to perform a post-model classification or evaluation to arrive at a 10-class provisional raster. The unique combinations of all 3 classifications were reviewed with a provisional correlation path to 1 of 10 CATINA members. And we kind of tried to follow the preponderance of evidence. So in essence, if 2 classifications pointed one way and 1 pointed the other, we just follow the 2 or follow our tacit knowledge. In the end, we do have more of a knowledge-based classification. But we pared down 100 unique combinations to those 10 classes, and the top 20 combinations by area covered roughly 99% of the landscape. So all final classifications were reviewed by MLRA staff as quality control, and to assure that it was consistent with both what was observed and what was known of soil landform relationships. So I'm going to turn it now back to Alan, and he's going to talk about our provisional correlation paths.
Well, using the model results, composition was evaluated in each of the 9 existing map units as were stratified by our zones. And the example here shows the modeling-based composition of one of those map units, Barnes-Viet-Tonka complex on 0 to 3% slopes. There were 4 components that exceeded 15% of the composition on that CATINA in that map unit. Logical correlation paths from the old map units into the new map units were selected. In this case, we chose Hamlet-Ballatin as a provisional correlation path. While the map unit paths were selected, the composition remained very provisional. On this slide on the left is a depiction of the 8 new MLRA map units following the provisional correlation paths. With the paths set, a second composition analysis was completed against our new MLRA map unit to refine our provisional map unit design. Composition and slope summaries were then compiled by delineation and compared to provisional map unit design. With the polygon level summaries complete, specific polygons were flagged as not representing the concept of the map unit correlation. And those such flags include where the wet soils were undermapped, where wet soils were overmapped, areas where there were excessive small delineations breaking our mapping convention, and where there were slope discrepancies. Digital edits were approached selectively. Most edits to remove excessive line work were applied globally with rules and logic. Problematic county joins included some field work to investigate discrepancies in map unit concepts. The majority of the Sergo lines were unchanged. Edits to improve the appearance of the lines over imagery or hillshades at detailed scales, as commonly used in other MLRA projects, was not a focus of this project. In this project, reviewing the polygons or groups of polygons flagged as not fitting the map unit concept took me about 2 weeks to complete edits. And thinking back to when I was field mapping, we thought we were doing well if we could get 8,000 acres covered in that time. To complete spatial changes in so short a time on 1.1 million acres project proved to me the great value of the DSM approach to MLRA projects. With our mapping and map unit concepts taking shape, I'll turn it back to Joe to talk about finalizing composition.
Thanks, Alan. So yeah, now we have our spatial edits complete. So it's probably an appropriate time to finalize our map unit concepts and bring them up to the approved status. So we did a final pass of map unit composition following the edits, and it was to be directly reflective of the model. Component percent RVs will represent the percent of the modeled component in each map unit, basically aligning with the mean. But we use percentiles to arrive at our lows and our highs in composition. So lows will represent the 10th percentile of modeled component composition per delineation, and the highs will represent the 90th percentile delineations. So our composition, in essence, will represent 80% of the variability found in the delineations of the concept. So here, this is illustrated in the Ballotin component. So 10% of delineations have less than 6% Ballotin in them of this map unit, and 10% have greater than 30% of Ballotin in the map unit. So that's how we arrived at our lows, RVs, and highs. And we used kind of similar logic in reevaluating our component slope gradient as compared to cell values. Again, the low, the 10th, and the high, the 90th. However, with slope analysis, our RV followed the median, and the delineation was, the concept of the delineation was really replaced with the concept of the cell. So as our approved Sergo map unit started to take shape, the focus returned again to our raster product that was foundational to all mapping. Aside of general qualitative confidence in the depiction of the raster classes, an accuracy assessment will give us an objective metric in evaluating the integrity of the raster in all products that we generate from it. While a stratified random sampling or some sort of design-based scheme would be ideal, we did have some logistical constraints and travel limitations, and that drove us to be as efficient as possible in the field. So we used a hybrid stratified random clustered scheme for the project, and several sites were targeted with 7 to 15 predetermined validation points at each site. We did stratify the sites into zones, and that represented the physiographic variability and the historical correlations. And so we were trying to get a geographically proportionate sample base. We also developed a custom field sheet to assure that all soil scientists involved in the accuracy assessment documented descriptions to a common standard that at minimum could be used for soil classification by the correlation team here. So in the end, we had a team of about 8 soil scientists collecting 180 descriptions in 1 week at a cost of about $80 per sample, including travel and gas. It's important to think about cost in designing a practical plan for an accuracy assessment with limited resources. We did collect some full 232s to fill in some data voids and collect some representative pedons, and also to support a new series that we were contemplating setting up at the time. The remaining descriptions, though, were abbreviated but contained sufficient information to classify. And so the pedons from the accuracy assessment were all correlated by one person, Alan, and they were all entered into NRCS. So here's an error matrix comparing the 5-meter provisional raster product to field descriptions. We also included a small buffer on each point. I think it was about 10 meters to provide a little bit of flexibility to account for some sources of positional error and extreme localized variability. The 3 classes highlighted here all proved both difficult to identify in the field or poorly discriminated in the model. With an insufficient pool of those descriptions, it was decided that these less extensive concepts would be captured within the range of associated soils, ultimately correlating the concepts out of the model for our final product. The remaining 7 classes of the model would be correlated So in final correlation, all pedons in the project area were then reevaluated. That's all the ones from the accuracy assessment, the ones from the traverses, and then we went back to the historical pedons, and we had access to the laboratory data that was collected for the project at that time, and also historical laboratory data from KSSL and North Dakota State University. So of those 390 pedons that we found, 264 were modeled correctly, and we selected those pedons to analyze ranging characteristics for our component data. Our pedons were analyzed in relation to both the correlated concept, but also the horizon depth and the properties and diagnostic features. And as analysis of the pedon data started, the taxons describing the landscape were again reevaluated and recorrelated as necessary. So our thin phase of Hamlet that we were describing in previous slides was now recorrelated to a new series Saurus. And then the taxonomic classification of Hamlet was modified slightly to reflect this higher water table identified in the descriptions. And we are actually reverting back to an older classification of that series. Tonka, the Tonka concept was also revised to a family level classification because we observed thinner albic horizons than described in the predominant range further east. Summaries of the pedons that were modeled correctly were then utilized to populate our horizon data for our rasters and our components for Sergo map units. There ended up being 12 laboratory pedons in the project area, and that really framed our population of chemical and physical data, and that accomplished one of our objectives from the initial evaluation. So prior to final correlation of the raster product, it was resampled to 10 meters and was extracted for the footprint of the Sergo map units. We filled larger anthropogenic voids from our broader highways with identical map unit concepts as found in Sergo. And we did one final pass of the accuracy assessment with our recorrelations and our 10-meter product. And that will be included in the correlation document and export metadata. So here's our results. We have 8 updated Sergo map units available, seamless and consistent. All busts and properties and interpretations are no longer apparent. And additionally, we have this 10-meter raster product with 7 raster map units, and it's now available on the Geospatial Data Gateway. Users can access the results of the project in whatever form of detailed soil information they choose to use. Some of the correlation products include our final accuracy assessment, those 390 pedons. They are all linked through the project. And we put a lot of work into the correlation documents for this project to document our process. And then one thing that Alan did here that was really commendable is he went out and discussed the major changes in Sergo with a technical team that included all the district conservationists in the area prior to any changes being made public. So that's it. I believe we all really enjoyed working on this project, and felt that it generated some significant results related to resource concerns, and that we gained some momentum and some energy towards a new era of MLRA field projects. It wasn't an MLRA, or it wasn't a GIS project, or a modeling project, or a mapping project. It was an attempt at a comprehensive MLRA project with a significant field component. Not all issues could be addressed to the attention that they required, but with every MLRA project, there will be future issues to address. So our take-home was make your next project just a little bit better. This project required a lot of support to achieve results. We're grateful to the leadership from Region 10, Michael Whitehead, and Wade Bott with North Dakota NRCS. They were really engaged and supported pooling resources to meet the objectives. This is probably something we'll need to do more of in the future, I'm guessing. For example, Alan here is now just a team of one. Contributors to the project represented 3 MLRA offices, 2 state offices, 2 area offices, 1 regional office, and the National Soil Survey Center. Collective time and expertise, with the collective time and expertise, we were able to accomplish something beyond what could have been done in an understaffed office. So contributors from this project were also included a soil scientist who walked the landscape through progressive soil survey. And we valued that historical perspective, and it benefited the end product. So with that, that's all I have, or all we have. So I think it might be a good time now for some discussion.
All right, sounds good, guys. And there's several questions in the chat and in the Q&A, so we'll start working through those. And I know that you had a slide that talked about how many soil scientists were involved in the data collection, but you could just tell us again how many soil scientists were involved in data collection.
Well, I'll let Lance address that for the training points,
yep.
and I'll address it for the accuracy assessment.
For the training points, the initial 150 borings that we had done were basically done by 2 soil scientists. It was myself and Dwayne Sanders, mostly.
Okay. And I think we had a team of 8 in 1 week for the accuracy assessment.
That's correct.
All right, and there's a question about the what you used to get the level of water in the wells. Were they level loggers?
Okay. These are the Hobo water level loggers are what we're using. They're the ones, I'm trying to think of the model number. Off the top of my head, I can't think of it, but it's the new ones that they have the barometric pressure on the bottom of the cylinder. So you just tie wire onto the top of the logger, you lower it down into the well. Instead of having one big cylinder on your riser and then, electrical wire all the way down, these are just one small cylinder that is dropped into the bottom of the well. You pull those up and you just attach them and then upload your data loggers there. So these are probably about 5 inches long instead of being a whole big circuit. So the model number on them is actually U20 001 004 Hobo water logger.
All right, and there's a question in the Q&A about what type of redox are you talking about? Iron depletions, iron accumulations, or both?
Both, and keying a lot on depletions. But we identified both and recorded both.
All right, another question. If there were one or more things that you could change or specify from the project outset, what would that be? And what upfront factors should MLRA soil survey offices or regional offices and states be cognizant of when designing and are proposing similar projects and their work plans?
That's a tough one. I think one thing, if you look through the soil survey manual and how that new chapter on digital soil mapping is written, I think we probably could have paid a little more attention to how that process was outlined. So we could have maybe, I think we probably could have done a lot more upfront work before Lance ever got out into the field. So that's one thing I would do differently. And again, we discussed documentation, making sure that we're consistent with documentation. That's another thing that's pretty critical. Let's see, I don't know if I got the entire scope of that question.
Yeah, I think so. So another question, did you develop different phases for each of the series by map unit?
No. They were, I mean, it's a till sheet. You're sort of drawing lines where you sort of think use and management changes. There's really no reason to identify unique components per map unit, at least not in this part of the world. You know, I'm not speaking for everywhere, but yeah, definitely not in this part of the world.
So another one, how would you respond to those that say DSM doesn't work?
It sure helped this project tremendously. We could have never accomplished what we did without it. To try to do that without DSM, we would have never got the quality or the quantity of work done.
I think it's, you know, to follow up on that, it's just a nice example that's not in the mountains. It's a flatland example, so to speak.
Right.
Another question, based on this work, did it lead to an update of MLRA or land resource unit concepts?
I don't think it did, but you know, there were some of those documentation things, like that thing about thinner albics. We're kind of getting sort of in this is the Utic moisture regime, but it's probably the furthest west extent of the Utic moisture regime in the continental part of the U.S. So I was thinking about, with as thin as the moloch epipetons that we were seeing, they were nice dark moloch epipetons, but they were thin. And then, you know, things like those E horizons that were a little bit shallower than other areas. It seemed like maybe we were looking at something that could be considered a different land resource unit, or yeah, or maybe even considered in MLRA, an MLRA update. So yeah, we're always thinking about that stuff.
There's a question in the chat about your block diagrams. Could you talk about how you made your block diagrams?
Well, I wonder if Michael's on. So we kind of had a rush to get our block diagram done for the calendar, and so we just finished this project. So we had this detailed mapping, and we thought we'd kind of throw it up on a 3D just to see what it looked like. I think I just used ArcScene or something. I'm not. I always find the 3D environment frustrating. That's why I was kind of rolling my eyes. It's not that easy to do to make it look nice, but we spent a little time, I think, in ArcScene, and I think I used Publisher or PowerPoint or something to clean it up a little bit with stratigraphy. So, yeah. I hope that answers.
There's some comments in the chat about the slide that you have up, you know, Sergo that you get through Web Soil Survey versus your output from this raster product. And so is there a plan to replace what's in Web Soil Survey with this newer information? Will that be part of the refresh coming up?
Well, the Sergo map units are in the refresh. They're updated. But again, you can see, and this is why we showed this slide. Sure, we've updated all these map units, but they're still not showing us much in this area in terms of variability, just based on how we had to design the map units. We weren't going to go in and reinvent the wheel with lines in this project. We didn't really need to. I think this sort of information, and again, this is not available in Web Soil Survey. We kind of mocked this up. But I think if you're doing field scale work, this isn't it's not an order one soil survey, but I think it's more useful in doing some applied conservation planning type things.
Or site-specific.
Site-specific, yeah. It's not site-specific information, but it could guide site-specific selection.
All right, and then I'll just ask a question, give people a last opportunity to enter theirs in the Q&A or the chat. I was looking at those donut-shaped landscapes that you have there, and those reminded me of pingo scars that I've seen in the Northeast. Are those, is that pothole region, are those pingos, or are they different?
Anybody?
Not familiar with that
terminology. Pringles, but not pingos.
I'm looking at the old soil survey leader here, the only one of us who actually worked in the East, and he doesn't know. No?
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to Joe and Alan and Lance for your time and effort to make this presentation, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. We had well over 190 people join today's webinar, and a recording of this webinar will be available on our Soil Survey Center YouTube channel within a few days. So feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. This concludes our webinar presentation.